At the graduation barbecue in my grandson's backyard, my son picked up my steak with a pair of tongs, dropped it onto the grass, and said, "If you want meat so badly, Mom, go chew it off the ground." A few people laughed. Not loudly, just enough. I looked down at the steak resting in the clover near my shoes. Then I looked back up at him, and I smiled. If you're listening to this, stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from. I've learned that humiliation sounds the same in every state. It just echoes differently. It was supposed to be a celebration. White folding tables lined the patio. Red and blue balloons floated near the fence. My grandson's graduation banner hung across the deck railing. Neighbors, co-workers, cousins, at least 40 people stood scattered across the yard with paper plates and plastic cups. The grill sizzled loudly behind my son. He wore an apron that read "Master of the Flame." Everyone thought it was funny. I had arrived early, as I always do. I brought homemade potato salad and a lemon cake my grandson loves. I wore a light blue blouse and pressed slacks. Nothing dramatic, just respectful. When my son handed out the steaks, he hesitated at mine. "You still eating red meat at your age?" he said casually. A couple of his friends smirked. "I'll manage," I replied. That's when he lifted the steak slightly higher than necessary, tilted the tongs, and let it fall. It landed face down on the lawn, grease soaking into the grass. There's a particular silence that happens before people decide whether something is a joke or not. That silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then he added, louder this time, "Want meat? Go chew it at the shelter. They feed people there, right?" This time the laughter came easier. My daughter-in-law stood near the patio table, arms folded, lips curved into a tight smile. Not surprised. Not uncomfortable. Prepared. I didn't bend down immediately. I didn't scold him. I didn't ask why. Instead, I reached for a napkin from the table beside me and wiped my hands slowly, even though they weren't dirty. If you've lived long enough, you learn that reacting too quickly gives other people control over the story. My grandson stared at the ground, then at me. He didn't laugh. That mattered. I finally looked. At my son again. "Congratulations on raising such a generous host," I said evenly. It wasn't sarcasm. It was volume control. He shrugged. "Lighten up, Mom. It's just a joke. Just a joke." I glanced around the yard. That grill he stood beside. I bought it 6 years ago as a housewarming gift. The patio furniture? Paid for with a check I wrote when they said money was tight. The down payment on this house. That came from the sale of my late husband's small butcher shop. Food is dignity. My husband used to say that while trimming ribeye behind the counter, hands steady, knife precise. I looked down once more at the steak on the grass. Then I stepped back. "I'm not very hungry," I said calmly. And I walked toward my car. No one stopped me. No one apologized. The laughter faded as the sound of the grill filled the space again. When I closed my car door, I didn't cry. I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, and replayed the scene, not emotionally. Factually. The tone. The witnesses. The property line. That backyard barbecue was held on land still partially protected by a trust. A trust with my name on it. My son thought he had dropped a piece of meat. What he actually dropped was distance. And distance, when measured properly, changes ownership in ways people don't anticipate. I started the engine and drove home at exactly the speed limit. Some lessons are taught with words. Others are taught with paperwork. That afternoon, I chose paperwork. I drove home without turning on the radio. The road was familiar. 12 minutes from their subdivision to my house. For stoplights. One long stretch of maple trees lining the median. I stopped at each light calmly, hands steady on the wheel. What happened in that backyard wasn't loud in my mind anymore. It was organized. He lifted the steak. He dropped it. He added the word shelter. And 40 people watched. When I pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun was leaning toward gold. My house looked the way it always had. Brick steady, porch clean, windows reflecting quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. No music. No balloons. No grill smoke. Just stillness. I placed my purse on the entry table and walked straight into the kitchen. Out of habit, I opened the refrigerator, though I wasn't hungry. There was leftover soup from Friday. A carton of eggs. Fresh vegetables. Plenty of food. Hunger had never been the issue. I poured myself a glass of water, 8 ounces, cold, and sat at the table. The trust paperwork wasn't something I thought about often. It had been created 8 years ago, after my husband passed. A simple estate structure designed to protect certain assets until my grandson turned 30. The house my son lives in sits on land that was partially transferred under that structure. At the time, I called it generosity. Today, I called it documentation. I finished my water and walked into my study. The folder labeled Whitmore Family Trust sat in the bottom drawer, exactly where it had always been. I didn't rush when I opened it. Inside were the original transfer documents, the protective clauses, and a provision that allowed conditional review if beneficiary conduct materially threatened the integrity or dignity of the trust grantor. Dignity. An old-fashioned word, perhaps, but legally defined. I read that line twice. Then I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. The barbecue was still happening, I imagined. Guests finishing dessert. My grandson opening cards. My son laughing easily again now that the moment had passed. Public humiliation has a short shelf life for the person delivering it. For the person receiving it, it becomes a timestamp. At 3:42 p.m., on his own lawn, my son suggested I eat like someone without a home. On property I helped secure. There's something about contrast that clarifies the mind. I didn't plan revenge. I planned review. Around 6 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A message from my daughter-in-law. Hope you didn't take it personally. It was just banter. Everyone was having fun. I read it once. Then again. No apology. Just reframing. I set the phone down without replying. If you're listening to this, understand something. The most dangerous kind of disrespect is the kind disguised as humor. It makes witnesses comfortable. It makes the target appear sensitive. And it makes correction look excessive. Unless correction is precise. I opened my laptop and drafted a short email to the attorney who had prepared the trust documents years ago. Would like to schedule a review regarding beneficiary conduct and property provisions. No urgency, but clarity needed. No emotion. No accusation. Just clarity. Before shutting down the computer, I looked once more at the maple tree in my backyard through the study window. Its roots run under this entire property, including the section where that barbecue was held. My son thought he embarrassed me over a piece of meat. What he exposed instead was structure. And structure, once examined, does not ignore imbalance. I turned off the lights and let the evening settle. Tomorrow, I would begin asking questions. Not loudly. Properly. The next morning, I woke up at 5:45 a.m., same time I've woken up for years. Routine has a way of stabilizing the mind. I made coffee. Not because I needed the caffeine, but because I needed the rhythm. Measure. Pour. Wait. Steam rising steadily. The barbecue photos had already begun circulating online. Neighbors smiling. My grandson holding his diploma. My son standing proudly beside the grill. In one photo, you could see the edge of the lawn near the patio. You could almost see the spot. But not quite. Humiliation rarely photographs well. It hides in angles. At 9:12 a.m., my attorney's office called back. Mrs. Whitmore, we can schedule a document review this afternoon if that works. It does, I said. I didn't explain why. By 1 p.m., I was seated across from a polished oak desk in a quiet law office I'd visited many times before. Framed degrees on the wall. Neutral carpeting. No drama. Mr. Halpern adjusted his glasses and opened the trust file. You mentioned beneficiary conduct, he asked. Yes. He skimmed the language slowly. The clause allows for reassessment if the grantor's dignity or intended use of the property is materially compromised, he read aloud. Define materially, I said. He paused. Public degradation. Documented hostility. Actions that contradict the spirit of the trust. Spirit of the trust. I folded my hands in my lap. The property was partially transferred under the assumption of family continuity and mutual respect, I said evenly. He nodded. Correct. And if that assumption no longer holds? There are mechanisms, he replied carefully. Reallocation. Conditional restructuring. Even temporary suspension of beneficiary privileges. Privileges. Interesting word. I did not smile. Would a public incident, witnessed by multiple individuals, qualify? I asked. He looked at me directly now. If documented properly, it could. I didn't recount the barbecue theatrically. I described it factually. Date. Location. Exact wording. He took notes. When I finished, he closed the file gently. Are you seeking removal? He asked. No, I said. Then what are you seeking? Clarification, I replied. Because clarity forces adults to reconsider their tone. Before leaving, I requested a certified copy of the original property transfer documents and a clause summary. No threats. No immediate action. Just paper. When I stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, the air felt cooler than the day before. Correction doesn't require rage. It requires alignment between action and consequence. At 4:30 p.m., my son called. "Mom, Elise said you left pretty upset yesterday." "I left," I said. He sighed lightly. "It was a joke." "Yes," I replied calmly. "It was." A pause. "You know I didn't mean anything by it." "I know exactly what you meant," I said. "That's why I left." He didn't respond immediately. Silence is uncomfortable for people who expect quick forgiveness. "I'll stop by later this week," he said finally. "That would be fine," I answered. After the call ended, I placed the certified documents in my study drawer. Not hidden. Prepared. There's a difference between punishing someone and recalibrating their understanding of value. My son thought he embarrassed me over a steak. What he revealed was how casually he now treated something that required respect to begin with. The barbecue lasted one afternoon. The trust structure lasts decades. And when structure is reviewed, tone changes quickly. Not because of anger, because of consequence. 2 days later, my son came by alone. No grill apron. No audience. Just him standing on my front porch at 7:18 p.m., hands in his pockets like he used to when he was a teenager trying to explain something away. I opened the door before he knocked. "Come in," I said. He stepped inside and looked around as if he hadn't been here in months. The same framed photos. The same wooden clock ticking in the hallway. "Nice place," he said lightly. "It's steady," I replied. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured him water. No iced tea this time. No cake. Just water. He cleared his throat. "Elise thinks you're overreacting," he began. "I haven't reacted," I said calmly. He shifted in his chair. "Mom, it was a joke. Everyone jokes like that. You know how these things are." "Yes," I said. "I know exactly how these things are." Silence settled between us. He looked at me carefully now, trying to read whether I was hurt, angry, dramatic. I was none of those things. "I helped you with that house," I said evenly. "Do you remember the closing day?" "Of course." "You couldn't meet the full down payment." He nodded slowly. "I transferred the remaining funds from the shop sale." I continued. "We structured it under the trust so it would protect the property for your son's future." He leaned back slightly. "I know, and I appreciate that." "Appreciation isn't the issue." He frowned. "Then what is?" "Understanding," I said. He exhaled. "You're not seriously thinking about changing anything, are you?" There it was. Not an apology. Concern. "I scheduled a review of the trust," I said plainly. His posture stiffened. "Why would you do that?" "Because the clause regarding grantor dignity exists for a reason." He stared at me. "You're bringing legal language into a family barbecue?" "No," I replied. "You brought public humiliation into protected property." The room went very still. He wasn't angry yet. He was recalculating. "It was one comment," he said quietly. "In front of 40 people. He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't think you'd take it this far." I folded my hands on the table. "That's the problem," I said. "You didn't think." Silence again. This time heavier. He looked around the kitchen, eyes resting briefly on the framed photograph of his father behind the butcher counter, sleeves rolled up, steady hands holding a cut of ribeye. "Dad would have laughed," he said weakly. "No," I answered softly. "He wouldn't have. Because food was never just food in this family. It was work. It was respect. It was earned. I'm not removing you from anything," I said after a moment. "I'm clarifying expectations." "Expectations of what?" "Conduct." He swallowed. "What happens if I don't agree?" I met his eyes evenly. "The trust doesn't require agreement. It requires compliance." There was no threat in my voice. Only structure. He stood slowly. "I didn't realize it meant that much to you." "It didn't," I said, "until you made it public." When he reached the door, he paused. "So what now?" "Now," I replied calmly, "we make sure it doesn't happen again." And for the first time since that barbecue, he understood something. Not anger. Not punishment. Consequence. And consequence, once introduced into a room, changes the temperature without anyone raising their voice. The next morning, I didn't call my attorney. I waited. Structure doesn't move impulsively. It observes. By Tuesday afternoon, word had traveled farther than I expected. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Cartwright from across the street, stopped by with a casserole dish she claimed was extra. She stood in my kitchen, lowering her voice slightly. I didn't like how that looked, she said carefully. On Sunday. I didn't ask her to clarify. She didn't need to. People noticed, she added. I'm sure they did, I replied evenly. Public humiliation has witnesses, and witnesses become quiet documentation. After she left, I placed the casserole in the refrigerator and sat down at the table. I opened a small leather notebook I've kept for years, not a diary, just a ledger of significant family moments. Birth dates, property transfers, financial notes, major conversations. On a fresh page, I wrote, Sunday, 3:42 p.m., public remark regarding food and shelter. Approximately 40 witnesses. Location, Whitmore Trust Property, Lot 17B. No emotion, just record. At 5:10 p.m., my son texted. Can we talk again? Elise wants to clear the air. Clear the air. Air only needs clearing when something lingers. They arrived together at 7 p.m. This time, Elise spoke first. We didn't realize the trust language was that specific, she said, folding her hands in front of her. It is, I replied. She glanced at my son before continuing. We don't want legal tension over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, I repeated calmly, would involve confusion. There was no confusion. She exhaled softly. It was meant to be playful. In whose direction? I asked. Silence. My son stepped in. We'll apologize publicly, he said quickly. If that's what this is about. Interesting. He thought this was about embarrassment being balanced with embarrassment. It's not about apology, I said. It's about acknowledgement. Elise's posture straightened. Acknowledgement of what? That property protected by the trust requires conduct consistent with its intent. And if we disagree? She asked. You don't have to agree, I replied evenly. You have to understand the terms under which you reside there. The air in the kitchen shifted. Not hostile. Measured. Elise leaned back slightly. You'd actually restructure ownership over one joke? I would review protective provisions over public degradation. I corrected. Words matter, especially legal ones. My son looked between us. So what do you want? I want clarity in writing, I said. An addendum affirming conduct expectations and reaffirming trust intent. They exchanged a glance. It wasn't defiance. It was calculation. That feels extreme, Elise said quietly. Extreme, I replied, is relative. Throwing food at your mother in front of your son's classmates is one form of extreme. Protecting property structure is another. I slid a copy of the clause summary across the table. This isn't punishment, I continued. It's preservation. Elise read silently. My son stared at the wall clock. Finally, he nodded. We'll review it. Good, I said. No raised voices. No dramatic exits. Just paper on a table. After they left, I closed the front door gently and returned to the kitchen. The house was quiet again. Sunday's laughter had faded. In its place was something sturdier. Boundaries. A barbecue lasts an afternoon. Property law lasts longer. And when boundaries are clarified, even jokes learn to stay within them. The draft addendum arrived 3 days later. Delivered by email first. Certified copy to follow. Elise had edited the language. I could tell immediately. The tone was corporate, polished, cautious, carefully neutral. Affirmation of conduct consistent with grantor intent. Interesting title. I printed the document and read it slowly at my kitchen table. It stated that all beneficiaries residing on trust-protected property acknowledge the foundational purpose of the asset, preservation of family dignity, continuity, and mutual respect. It included a clause committing to avoid public conduct that materially undermines the standing of the grantor. Materially undermines. That was Mr. Halpern's phrasing. My son had signed. Elise had signed. I did not smile when I saw their signatures. This wasn't victory. It was structure restored. That evening, my grandson called. Grandma, he said quietly. Dad feels bad. Does he? I asked gently. Yeah. He said he went too far. I leaned back in my chair. Did he tell you why? He said it looked wrong. Looked wrong. Visibility changes accountability. I'm proud of you for not laughing, I said. There was a small pause. I didn't think it was funny, he admitted. Good. Seeds of understanding begin early. The following Sunday, another gathering was planned. Smaller this time. Just immediate family. No neighbors. No coworkers. My son called beforehand. Will you come? Yes, I replied. When I arrived, the grill was already hot. The same backyard. The same patio furniture. But the atmosphere. was different. Measured. My son handed me a plate himself. A steak. Properly cooked. He didn't make a speech. He didn't dramatize anything. He simply said, medium rare. The way you like it. I accepted it. No applause. No tension. Elise set a bowl of salad on the table and avoided sarcasm entirely. Her tone was respectful. Intentional. We sat down together. Conversation moved carefully at first. School plans, college applications, work updates. Normal things. Halfway through the meal, my son cleared his throat. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. I didn't interrupt. About conduct. And property. And I respect. He glanced briefly at his son. I won't put you in that position again. I nodded once. That's all that was required. No lecture. No reminder. Just confirmation. Later, as the sun dipped lower over the fence line, I looked across the yard. The same grass where the steak had landed a week earlier now held nothing but shadows. The grill still smoked gently. But this time, no one laughed at anyone's expense. Correction doesn't need spectacle. It needs clarity. The trust remained intact. The property remained theirs to enjoy. But the boundaries were visible now. And visible boundaries prevent repetition. As I drove home that evening, I realized something. My son hadn't needed punishment. He needed recalibration. Humiliation is loud. Structure is quiet. And quiet, when enforced consistently, changes behavior more effectively than anger ever could. The following week felt steadier. Not warmer, just steadier. No dramatic gestures followed that second barbecue. No public apologies posted online. No performative family photos with captions about growth. Instead, there was consistency. My son began calling before hosting gatherings. Just immediate family this Sunday, he'd say. Let me know what you'd like. He had never asked that before. Choice is a quiet form of respect. One afternoon, Elise stopped by alone. She stood in my doorway holding a small envelope. I wanted to give you this in person, she said. Inside was a printed copy of the updated trust addendum, notarized and filed. We've added an internal policy for family-hosted events on trust property, she continued. Clear guidelines about conduct. It seemed appropriate. Corporate solution. Predictable, but effective. I read the summary she handed me. It outlined expectations for public gatherings, referencing respectful acknowledgement of founding contributions when applicable. Founding contributions. Interesting how language evolves. You didn't have to formalize that, I said. She met my eyes evenly. Yes, she replied. We did. There was no sarcasm in her voice now. No subtle positioning. Just recalibration. Before she left, she hesitated slightly. I underestimated how much history sits behind that house, she said. Most people do, I answered. Because history isn't visible in fresh paint or new patio furniture. It's embedded in the mortgage transfer, the escrow statements, the handwritten checks from a small butcher shop account that once balanced every week to the penny. That evening, I opened the old ledger again. Under the entry for Sunday, 3:42 p.m., I added one more line. Addendum signed. Conduct affirmed. Structure preserved. Not revenge. Resolution. 2 days later, my grandson came by after school. He stood in the kitchen eating a cookie while I prepared tea. Dad says we're going to help at the community food drive next month, he said casually. Is that so? Yeah. He said it's important to remember where food comes from. I paused for a moment. Not because of irony. Because of understanding. Food had always meant something in our family. It meant work. It meant dignity. It meant provision without humiliation. Good, I said softly. When he left, I stood by the window watching him walk down the driveway. Correction doesn't always show up as apology. Sometimes it shows up as action. The trust remained intact. The house remained theirs to live in. But something else had shifted, not ownership, not legality. Tone. At that graduation barbecue, my son had dropped a steak onto the grass and suggested I eat like someone without shelter. He thought it was humor. What he learned was hierarchy. Not of age. Of foundation. Respect doesn't demand volume. It demands memory. And once memory is restored, behavior adjusts accordingly. I didn't remove anyone from anything. I simply reminded them of the structure they stand on. And structures, when acknowledged properly, don't need to shout to be respected. 2 weeks after the addendum was signed, something else happened. Quietly, my son invited me to attend a small dinner he was hosting for a few colleagues. Nothing extravagant, just 6 people from his firm and their spouses. It would be held, again, in the same backyard. I'd like you there, he said over the phone. As family. There was a slight emphasis on the last word. I agreed. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt different from the graduation barbecue. No loud music. No oversized crowd. Just soft conversation and careful hosting. This time, my son greeted me at the gate. Not from behind a grill. At the gate. Mom, he said, opening it fully. I'm glad you came. Inside, he introduced me to each guest by name. This is my mother, he said evenly. She helped us secure this house years ago. Secure. Not old-fashioned. Not sensitive. Secure. Language reveals correction. Elise stood beside him, nodding politely. When she handed me a plate later, she did it directly. Would you like the first serving? She asked. Not performative. Measured. I accepted. The grill sizzled again. Same equipment, same backyard, but the tone had changed entirely. Halfway through dinner, one of the guests complimented the property. Beautiful lot, he said. You've done well. My son glanced at me before answering. We had help at the beginning, he said. My mother structured the foundation. Structured. Foundation. These weren't accidental word choices. I didn't interrupt. I didn't elaborate. Correction doesn't need repetition. Later in the evening, as plates were cleared and conversations softened, my son stepped closer to me near the edge of the patio. I understand now, he said quietly. Understand what? I asked. That public moments don't disappear, he replied. They define things. I nodded once. Yes, they do. He looked out at the yard, at the grass where the stake had fallen weeks earlier. I won't treat you like that again, he added. I know, I said calmly. Because he had already adjusted his behavior. The addendum hadn't removed him from the property. It had removed his assumption. Assumption that humor outranks dignity. Assumption that generosity has no memory. As I drove home later that night, I realized something important. I hadn't reclaimed power. I had clarified structure. The trust remained intact. The property remained protected. The relationships remained possible. But now they were anchored by visible boundaries. At that graduation barbecue, my son thought he was making a joke about meat and shelters. What he did instead was test the integrity of the foundation beneath his own feet. Foundations do not argue. They either hold or they shift. In this case, they held. Because I reviewed them. And when you review structure calmly, without anger, you don't fracture a family. You recalibrate it. A month passed without incident. No sharp jokes. No careless comments. Just steady behavior. The backyard gatherings continued, but the tone never drifted back to that afternoon. My son no longer performed humor at someone else's expense. He hosted carefully now, introducing guests properly, acknowledging contributions without exaggeration. Structure had done its work. One evening, I received a formal envelope in the mail. Not from my attorney, from my son. Inside was a copy of a newly drafted estate outline, his own. He had updated his will. There was a short handwritten note attached. I reviewed what you built. I'm modeling mine the same way. Modeling. That word mattered. His document included a protective clause for my grandson, educational funding secured, property distribution tied to conduct expectations, and a clear statement about preserving family dignity. He had not copied my trust. He had understood it. The following Sunday, we gathered again, just the four of us this time. No guests. No audience. We sat at the patio table where weeks earlier everything had shifted. My son placed a steak on my plate himself. No commentary. Just placement. Medium rare, he said again, but this time with a small smile that wasn't defensive. During dinner, he mentioned the food drive he and my grandson had volunteered for. We helped serve about 100 families, he said. It changes your perspective. Perspective is often born from contrast. After the meal, we lingered outside as the sun lowered over the fence line. Elise spoke quietly. I didn't grow up thinking about property the way you do, she admitted, or about how small actions affect legacy. Most people don't, I replied, until something forces them to. She nodded. No resentment. No rivalry. Just adjustment. Later that evening, when I returned home, I walked into my study and opened the trust drawer one more time. Not because I needed to review anything. Because I wanted to place his updated estate outline beside it. Two structures. Different generations. Same principle. Respect is not inherited automatically. It's maintained. At the graduation barbecue, my son threw a steak onto the grass and told me to eat at a shelter. He believed it was humor. What it became was a correction point. Not just for him. For the way our family defines ownership, dignity, and public conduct. I did not remove him from the house. I did not threaten eviction. I clarified the terms under which generosity exists. And generosity, once clarified, becomes deliberate rather than assumed. When families fracture, it is rarely over the first offense. It is over the absence of boundary. We restored the boundary. Quietly, the grass where the stake had landed is green again. But the memory remains, not as resentment, as reference. And reference, when acknowledged, protects what anger would have damaged. As autumn settled in, the backyard changed color. The maple tree at the edge of the fence line turned deep red first, then gold. The air cooled. The grill was used less often. But the shift that mattered wasn't seasonal. It was behavioral. My son began asking my opinion before making visible decisions about the property. Not because the trust required it. Because he understood the structure behind it. One evening, he called about adding a small extension to the patio. Just widening it by a few feet, he said. I wanted to run it by you first. You don't need permission, I replied calmly. You need alignment. There was a brief silence. Then are we aligned? He asked. Yes, I said. As long as the intent remains preservation. Preservation. That word had replaced humor in his vocabulary. A few days later, he invited me to attend a neighborhood association meeting being held in his home. Several families were gathering to discuss improvements and long-term planning for the block. When introductions circled the room, he didn't position me as a retiree or old school. He said, simply, my mother structured the trust that helped us secure this property. No elaboration. No embellishment. Just fact. People nodded respectfully. That's how tone shifts, not with dramatic speeches, but with accurate framing. During the meeting, one neighbor mentioned concerns about rising property taxes and long-term stability for families on fixed incomes. Without hesitation, my son glanced at me. She understands long-term planning better than I do, he said. He invited my perspective. Publicly, I spoke briefly. About asset protection. About foresight. About the importance of structuring generosity so it doesn't erode under pressure. No one laughed. No one smirked. They listened. After the meeting, as guests filtered out, my son walked me to my car. I didn't realize how easily public tone can shift respect, he said. It doesn't shift respect, I replied. It reveals it. He nodded slowly. I won't forget that again. As I drove home, I thought back to that graduation barbecue. The stake landing on the grass. The word shelter spoken lightly. 40 witnesses. If I had shouted that afternoon, perhaps people would have remembered the argument. If I had threatened eviction immediately, perhaps people would have remembered the conflict. Instead, they remembered the correction. Weeks later, what lingered wasn't embarrassment. It was structure. The trust remained unchanged. The property remained intact. But the culture around it had evolved. At my grandson's graduation barbecue, my son threw my steak on the ground and suggested I eat like someone without a home. He believed it was humor. What it became was a turning point. Not because I punished him, because I clarified the foundation. And when a foundation is clarified, every future gathering stands differently upon it. By late November, the air had turned sharp enough to see your breath in the mornings. The grill had been covered for the season. Patio chairs stacked neatly against the fence. The yard where everything shifted that summer now looked ordinary again. But the ordinary felt different. One Saturday afternoon, my son asked if he could stop by. I need advice, he said. Not clarification. Not alignment. Advice. He arrived with a folder under his arm, building permits, financial projections, renovation estimates. He wanted to refinance part of the property to fund an expansion of his business. I won't move forward without reviewing how it interacts with the trust, he said. That sentence would not have existed 3 months earlier. We sat at my kitchen table, papers spread between us. He walked me through the numbers carefully. No rushing. No dismissing concerns. When I asked about risk exposure, he answered directly. I've built contingencies this time, he said. This time, growth without structure had nearly cost him more than embarrassment. I reviewed the documents quietly, making small notes in the margins. If you proceed, I said, ensure the refinancing preserves the protective clause. Do not weaken it for speed. He nodded immediately. I won't. There was no defensiveness in his voice. Only awareness. Before he left, he paused near the doorway. I've been thinking about that day, he admitted. About how easy it was to cross a line because I assumed you'd absorb it. Assumed? Yes, I said softly. You did. He looked down briefly. I won't assume. That again. I didn't need more than that. Later that week, at a small family dinner, my grandson asked if he could learn how to grill properly. Grandma says food means something, he told his father. My son glanced at me before answering. She's right, he said. And this time, there was no irony in his tone. They stood together by the grill. Not to perform, not to entertain, but to teach. Hands steady. Instructions clear. I watched from the patio, not intervening. Food is dignity. My husband used to say that. And dignity, once challenged, had been restored, not through anger, but through structure. At my grandson's graduation barbecue, my son threw my steak on the ground and told me to eat at a shelter. He thought it was a joke. What it became was a recalibration of authority, ownership, and tone. The trust remained intact. The property remained theirs to enjoy, but the culture surrounding it had shifted permanently. Not because I demanded respect, because I defined its boundaries. By winter, the yard would be covered in frost. By spring, the grass would grow again. But the foundation beneath that soil, legal, structural, generational, would remain unchanged. Some lessons are loud. Ours was quiet. And quiet lessons, when properly understood, last longer than laughter ever does. Winter settled fully by January. The backyard where everything had shifted months earlier was now quiet under a thin layer of frost. The grill was covered. The patio empty. The maple tree stood bare, branches reaching upward without apology. Life moved forward. My son refinanced carefully, preserving the protective clause exactly as we discussed. The paperwork was reviewed twice. Signed once. Filed properly. No shortcuts. At the next small family dinner, there were no speeches, no references to the past. Just steady behavior. He set the table himself. Elise poured water before anyone asked. My grandson asked if he could help in the kitchen. Ordinary things. But ordinary things carry weight when they're intentional. Halfway through the meal, my son paused and looked at me directly. I've been thinking about legacy, he said. I waited. Not money, he clarified. Behavior. I nodded slightly. That's the only part people remember, I replied. He glanced toward the backyard window. I never want him, he said, meaning his son, to think it's acceptable to humiliate someone publicly, especially family. There it was. Not an apology. Understanding. After dinner, we stepped outside for a moment despite the cold. The grass was stiff beneath our shoes. You could still see the faint outline of where summer gatherings had once left heavier wear on the lawn. The spot where the steak had landed was invisible now, but we both knew where it had been. He stood beside me quietly. I thought it was harmless, he said. I know, I answered. And I thought you'd just absorb it. I know that too. Silence hung between us. Not tense, not fragile. Resolved. You didn't embarrass me back, he added. No, I said. That wouldn't have corrected anything. Because correction isn't about reversal. It's about structure. At my grandson's graduation barbecue, my son threw my steak onto the grass and told me to eat at a shelter. People laughed. I smiled. I left. I reviewed the trust. I clarified the clause. I enforced the boundary. Not to punish. To preserve. Months later, what remained wasn't conflict. It was recalibrated behavior. The trust still protects the property. The house still belongs to the next generation. But now it rests on something stronger than assumption. It rests on memory. Food is dignity. Property is responsibility. And respect, once defined clearly, doesn't need to be demanded again. As I drove home that night, frost lining the edges of the road, I thought about how easily families fracture when pride answers insult. We didn't fracture. We adjusted. Some people think strength is loud. In my experience, strength is quiet paperwork, steady posture, and the discipline to respond proportionally. The barbecue lasted one afternoon. The foundation remains. And foundations, when protected properly, outlast every careless joke ever spoken over a grill.